Welcome to another edition of the Business of AI podcast. And I'm delighted today to be welcoming Alex Skinner, the CEO and co-founder of Pixelate. And we're actually in person today. So welcome, Alex, to the studio.
Yeah, in real life. Yeah, and I'm very pleased to be here.
Fantastic. And we've been chatting a lot about how we use AI. We've been in a couple of sessions together on stage over the last couple of months as well, where we've been talking about specifically how we can use AI in the voluntary sector, the not-for-profit sector. So I'm really keen to unpack that a bit more for our podcast audience as well. But could we start off, Alex, by you just telling us a bit about your background and how you got into doing what you're doing today, and a bit about Pixelate. What does it do?
So I'm originally a technologist. So I was a programmer originally, and I started Pixelate Group around 25 years ago. And at that time we were building sort of large scale digital systems, sort of straight out of the back of the .com silly season. And all manner of organizations, some very big brands. Also, we did a project for Arup back in the day for a sort of global intranet. And then we fell into the sort of association and not-for-profit market. I like to say it was strategic. It really wasn't. It was one of those ones where you work with similar businesses, you solve similar problems, you then realize that most of these businesses have the same challenges. And we've been building technology platforms for predominantly the association market, in English-speaking markets, so the UK and US. And ultimately building a business that's grown over that period of time.
Fantastic. And we're really happy with the product as well. So we're actually using the product to power a lot of our member platform as well now. So we can really speak as a user as well as just kind of actually talking about it in the abstract. But I wanted to get into talking a bit more about how AI in general is helping to drive productivity. Because when I've spoken to not-for-profit companies, organizations as well, they're really interested in AI. Everyone's heard about it now, but they want to understand how it can increase that productivity. So you are empowering a lot of not-for-profits.
Sure.
Could you give us some examples of how that works?
Yeah, so I mean, associations are interesting businesses in the sense of they have a cyclical relationship with their customers. They're much more interested in preserving member value, demonstrating value as organizations, and there is that sort of classic having to do a lot with not a lot. So you'll find that you've got these sometimes 6-10 person organizations that may be ultimately servicing a sort of 50-100,000 members. So especially with organizations where the sort of the organizational membership is sort of trade associations where perhaps they have 100 members, but those members then represent the employees within those organizations, so they can be pretty vast in terms of what they want to do. And ultimately they're trying to solve quite often valuable problems. A lot of organizations will be causal. They'll be doing great work for civil society. And so in our business, we have been specifically thinking around how we can kind of create sort of unified platforms for these organizations where they get that sort of classic 360 view of the world, the 360 view of the member. They're very interested in sort of the engagement with their members and the value that the members get from being a member. And so with AI, it's kind of a natural extension of that in terms of saying, well, we have these sort of cyclical processes that we go through, or we have certain things that we want to sort of put front and center in front of a member, and how can we then use AI to support that? And I think a lot of the time we see that most technology deployed for these organizations is either a vitamin or it's a painkiller.
Yeah.
So you're either talking about either laborious processes that these organizations have to do, and how they can use AI to sort of accelerate, augment their staff and be able to achieve more within the same time. Or sometimes, be able to to achieve something that previously was purely aspirational. They couldn't do it because you could never hire enough people to be able to do that job manually. And so, there are examples of organizations that are creating new revenue streams and creating sort of new opportunities that they couldn't have dreamt of before. So yeah, it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, let's break it down a bit into some of those component parts as well, because we've used some examples, I think, in the past where we've talked about the complexity
Mm-hmm.
of the task. So whether that be there's a huge amount of data,
Mm-hmm.
and we could talk about maybe the legacy data being in different formats, but
Sure.
actually for a lot of these associations, I know that sometimes the data is paper.
Yeah.
It's old paper
Mm-hmm.
files in boxes or lever arches. So part of the problem is actually the complexity of getting it from that old format into just kind of electronic digital data that can then be processed. So that's kind of one bucket. But are there any other areas like that as well that you think are kind of big complex areas that technology can help to solve?
Yeah, I mean, and obviously there's different things. So, for example, I mean, you're right. You're right. I mean, associations are probably very typical in the sense of they are sort of document shovelers. They love moving. They love documents. They use documents for everything. If you're applying to a sort of an academic association, and you're needing to sort of submit documents, and you're having to submit certificates, and you're having to submit sort of credentials. There's a lot of processes for organizations where documents are the foundation, and actually approving those documents. And obviously, as you were saying as well, a lot of these organizations, a part of their member value proposition will be the sort of archive of materials that they have in journal articles, more so online now, but some of them will still have scans, or they will have documents in those forms. So identifying sort of common recipes or pain points within the organization can be accessing knowledge and being able to find where that knowledge is, and being able to sort of say, well, look, here's the answer to the question you were looking for, and I found this on page 9 of this particular journal article, and here's the citation, and that kind of thing. But actually, in many businesses, there will be what you could describe as a sort of happy path. And the happy path might be, for example, some kind of application for a grant, or some kind of submission of an abstract for an academic conference, whereby materials are being submitted, and therefore you might want to automate, or at least provide a degree of triage. And I think well, the reason I sort of say happy path versus not is, if we have, for example, something that users are applying for, and the worst case scenario is that somebody applies for something that isn't a good fit for them, they won't really get the value from it, but there's no consequence. There's not a regulator. This isn't sort of somebody applying for a position that they're not qualified for. Those kind of things, where you can use AI to a reasonable degree of reliability now, to say, well, look, worst case scenario, somebody's going to get access to something they're not going to get value from. It's really not a problem. However, if we were going to reject somebody for something, we're going to have the AI sort of suggest that this person is rejected, and then we're going to take it through a sort of human in the loop to go to someone and say, well, actually, no, you got it wrong, and this is why you got it wrong. And then you're then training and improving it. So I mean, I talk a lot to the organizations we work with around recipes, and these are kind of recipes for the sorts of problems where we can use AI well. What I do see is a lot of instances where people are trying to use AI for things that they don't need to.
Yeah.
So where AI is really good at working with sort of unstructured data and making sense of it, we're seeing instances where people are being sort of recommended to use AI for something that really is a rules problem. It's a rules engine problem, and actually there are better ways of solving that problem.
So it's really interesting to hear what you're saying there about the recipes. I really like that concept, because as we're starting to break it down, we started off talking about the data, and in my head coming next was the sort of workflows, and then on top of that you have the analysis. So I suppose the workflows is the recipes that you're talking about. But could you talk us through how you sort of analyze that, where does AI fit in to those 3 different levels?
Yeah, and I think I mean, again, it's an analogy that works for me in terms of what are the ingredients. So the ingredients may be raw. So for example, data in a sort of a structured form is an example to me of a raw ingredient, whereas that certain elements of our recipe require some degree of pre-preparation or cooking, be that I'm having to sort of peel the onion, or I'm having to cook the pasta, right? So if you think of AI from a perspective of I need to take this this webinar recording, I need to transcribe it, that's a bit of pre-preparation I need to do in order for that ingredient to really work in what it is that I'm looking to do. So that's obviously part of it, but in many respects, you can think of the different AI providers and different AI models as being more or less appropriate, or more or less appropriate for the type of recipe that you're trying to achieve. So if we're working with personal data, if we're working with PII data, then in addition to sort of making judgments around should I or should I not process this, is it appropriate to, do I have consent, and all of the kind of frameworks around that, there may be models that are more or better suited to that particular thing. So we may be using some open weights models, we may be using things locally, whereas actually once we've kind of distilled the output and we're now working with the sort of the report that summarizes our members' participation, or whatever the output format is, we then may be using some of the sort of more frontier models to do some really nice visual work or something like that. So to me, it's a nice way of thinking about it, because it sort of says, well, look, we're not using one particular technique, or we're not using one particular model for the entire production process, for the entire cooking process, but we're using the right tool at the right time in order to sort of transform things. So that's why I think about it that way.
Yeah, no, I think it's a helpful analogy to think about it as cooking. And I know, talking to some of the members of our audience and events we've been to, often it can seem quite overwhelming to try and get your head around how AI works. And so I think that part of the key role for our organizations is to actually help people to understand the inputs and the outputs, and ultimately it is quite a simple process that we're talking about here. It's about getting all of the data as a foundation, running those workflows, those recipes, to be able to kind of process, analyze the data, and then have the analysis at the top there that allows you to bring out those insights. Those are relatively simple kind of processes, and to the point you made before, actually the challenge is about understanding why you want to do this. What are you trying to achieve by doing all of this? And a lot of the time, and we've talked about this before, we'll see companies, organizations will rush to try and put the solution first, which might be the chatbot or ChatGPT, without really thinking about the problem. And actually that means that they don't think about this kind of little pyramid structure. They don't think about all of the sort of ways in which they should be building this logically. They're just rushing to that first of all. So could you give some examples that you've come across where you have seen people starting with a solution rather than the problem, and what advice you would have about how to frame that problem better?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think this is a challenge as well with vendors in specifically, and obviously most vendors are very much pushing various kind of AI features and functions. I think the biggest challenge that we have is kind of trying to kind of balance our overarching enthusiasm for using AI with the kind of marketing messaging that says, build your agent on our platform. It's easy, quick to market, quick to value, these kinds of things. And it can be, and I think focusing on sort of either valuable problems, focus on valuable, in my mind, focus on valuable, boring problems, because if the problem is boring, it's probably lower risk as well. And building confidence around a problem which is valuable, and definable, and easy to kind of manage the kind of risks around. If we come back to the kind of recipe analogy, we know that in sort of large scale businesses that are sort of have processes, take McDonald's, they are fanatic in their processes around consistency of product, and therefore when you're sort of seeing the kind of the temperature checks that are being done on the burgers in order to kind of validate consistency, one of the challenges we know with sort of probabilistic based technology is that by its very nature, it is not consistent, neither can it be. And so how do we put in place the kind of the guardrails or the controls in order to actually say, if we want a consistency of operation, how can we make sure that using AI we can see that consistency? I wrote a blog post the other week, actually, that was kind of inspired by the work that special educational needs has working with neurodivergent children. And if we consider AI as a kind of a neurodivergent intelligence, and actually saying, well, actually different AI models will have different neurodivergent behavior in terms of their how they think and how they respond, some of the kind of scaffolding that we see in special education around kind of supporting breaking problems down into pieces. There's a lot of analogies that are very similar. And so actually when people are thinking about deploying AI, I think when you sort of break it down into pieces and say, well, okay, what are the problems we're looking to solve? What are the outcomes? What are the ways in which we make sure that we know how a result has been reached? What are our ways of assessing accuracy? You know, those types of things. But I think when you create a kind of an empathetic kind of framework around viewing the AI as a kind of neurodivergent intelligence and start saying, okay, well, we're not going to simply say that when I switch to Gemini, I get better results than OpenAI, because it's not better, it's different. And it's a different, and if you view it in that way, it can be quite helpful.
That's really interesting. One of the big trends that I'm seeing at the moment across the industry is a interest in the human side of the technology, actually the psychology, and so much of the principles of trying to understand how human works are actually now applicable to technology, and exactly what you were just saying there. And it's almost that's the area that needs the better understanding. So when you broke it down into those kind of processes, then you're effectively talking about the ways in which humans learn, and we're getting to the stage now where machines are starting to get to that same process. And this will be part of the challenge as agents are built and people start to be managing agent teams or teams of hybrid humans and agents. Actually, the challenges they're going to have to face there are how do they manage competing groups. So I think everything you talk about there, those principles will be vital. I know you're sort of looking a bit into agents and agentic AI. What are you seeing as being the big opportunities to use agentic within this sector and the broader not-for-profit sector?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of pieces, and again, if you make some analogies and say, you know, for example, if we have a colleague and we've hired a new colleague to do a certain job, there are a lot of parallels. You know, a lot of parallels from sort of human management and how to sort of think about creating your agents. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we see at the moment is kind of if you have an agent which is akin to a person, and a person has inherent capabilities and inherent knowledge. And obviously, when we're setting up agents, we will typically say, we want you to be grounded in the organizational knowledge. We don't want you to hallucinate. We want you to be sort of only using the tools and capabilities that we're providing you, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the mistakes that I can see, and I would say it's not helped by the kind of by the model creators in the direction of travel. So if we say, for example, with the models, broadly speaking, they're reaching a degree of parity where you really can't tell the difference sometimes now between the answers that you get from a Claude or the answers that you get from a ChatGPT. I mean, they're all brilliant, right? They're all doing amazing things. But what we're seeing actually is, if you consider that an agent having certain capabilities could be an agent calling a certain tool, doing a certain thing, or in fact, an agent having the ability to consult another agent. So if you put that into the human context, either a human has the knowledge to do something, or they have the ability to consult a document or consult a procedure, or they have the ability to ask a colleague, right? And some of these kind of parallels. One of the big fundamental differences, though, is in a human sense, organizations will have standard operating procedures. They will have reams of manuals that define how that particular role should be done and what is the kind of the way of doing or performing that particular role. And what we see is actually people are not spending the effort to make sure that they are synthesizing these operating processes into a context that the agent has. You know, a lot of the time the agents will have quite basic understanding. You are a customer service agent. You are here to provide customer service for XYZ business. And here is where you can consult the documentation. Whereas actually, if they're making the effort to synthesize almost an equivalent of an SOP for that agent,
SAP.
a standard operating procedure, then ultimately the quality and reliability that they will get from that agent will be, so actually there's, a lot of the work that we're seeing is less around AI and more around approaching it from a human perspective of saying, if this was a human worker, you wouldn't have them consulting the filing cabinet repetitively. You would synthesize the vast volume of documents that people need for their day to day. You would be synthesizing that into an SOP, and that's obviously the equivalent context window where you say, okay, here are your instructions of how I want you to behave, do no harm, stay grounded in my knowledge. But over time, you would be synthesizing standard operating procedures from its day-to-day workings in order to gain consistency. And that's the, if you look at McDonald's, there's some fabulous books on how they, as organizations create operational consistency through their processes and the McDonald's way of doing things. It's a similar parallel.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Just again, that kind of point around the technology is augmenting humans.
Yeah.
But in this instance, it's making us think about how we can be more effective as team leaders, as managers of knowledge, sharing all of those systems. So it's allowing us to focus on being really efficient as humans, whilst the machines go on and do all the sort of more complex and the boring tasks that actually then we don't want to have to do.
Yeah, and the challenge I find, especially when I talk to organizations, is, I will be making things sound far more complicated and far more involved, because I'll be talking about sort of, organizational ontologies and saying, well, look, if you want to have AI agents that are really great at what you want them to do, you need to give them the context. It's very easy just to say, oh, just use this thing and click here and click there. And of course you can. And actually the ability to create agents very quickly is on a whole plethora of different platforms is definitely there. But the difference is that point of reliability. If you're having an agent doing something that matters, where there is a consequence of reliability, or the extra 10% of value comes from that reliability, then that's where there's a much broader need.
It's a really interesting point, because you've got those two things going on. You could either say we need to get this done fast, and so let's just go out and find a tool that will help us build agents and get it done. Or kind of what you're saying is plan and think about actually what you're trying to achieve here, design it properly, and then build the agents around that. So that they're quite different models, but I think what we often see, or we're starting to see, is people just go racing in to do that.
Definitely.
What's the good way to get started? Because I'm conscious that, particularly in the NFP sector, people might be listening to this, they might not really have much experience yet of using agents. They're kind of thinking, sounds interesting, sounds great. How do they get started?
Yeah, I mean, I think how we tend to starting small and iterating. So this is not the typical big tech procurement where you put together an RFP and you create a 200-page requirements document that defines your entire business processes, and then you go out to market and you go through that kind of process. So, starting small and iterating. I think in the businesses we work with, augmenting knowledge from across an organization such that I can build a chat assistant that my team can use in order to deal with incoming inquiries and be able to field them more quickly is a good starting position for most businesses. As you build confidence in the responses that you're getting from these agents and the confidence from the team, having an agent that can be used out of hours or field common questions. The typical thing for organizations a lot of the time will be our members contact us to answer questions that they could answer themselves if only they were to go to the right page on the website and have a look at the answer. So you can have some pretty low hanging fruit that most organizations can, in a relatively low risk way, do things. I think any kind of repetitive processes whereby there is an analysis requirement. I mean, really anything I can train a junior member of staff to do, where there's volume, so if it's a case of, well, we get this many documents submitted and I want you to check that the name on the insurance policy matches the name of the member, and that the valid to and valid from date is across the period I'm expecting it to be. There are certain recipes for these kinds of things where we can augment and give our teams functions that then frees them up to do more valuable things for us.
Now, who should start this within an organization? I'm conscious that, you're a technologist, that's been your background, so you understand how technology works, how to build these systems, system design, all of that good stuff. But people listening to this might be thinking, well, I don't come from a technology background. Maybe they're from marketing, maybe they're from fundraising, from different departments across the associations. And they're kind of thinking, well, who's going to do this? Because they don't have the technical skill.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think a lot of the time we deal a lot with operations teams rather than technical teams. I mean, it's a little bit like if you say in the very early days of the web, websites were seen as an IT problem, and you would deal a lot with IT teams. And then as things matured, you would end up dealing more with comms teams over time as the technology thing was seen as more of a given. So I think to a degree, the best conversations are had with business people, because then you are focusing on the business outcome rather
framing
than
that problem.
You're framing it that way. So our preference is always to be dealing with the business to talk about whether in a membership organization that might be the membership team or it might be the comms team. Because then you are framing it around the business problem, and then the technological solution will come out of that. I think if you start off as a technical procurement almost, then you rush to tech and you rush to particular vendors, and you start with it then becomes how am I going to implement XYZ technology, rather than starting with the problem you're looking to solve and then working back to the technology. Because these days, I mean, I think there are wonderful platforms out there, and there's lots of different ways to solve the problem, but starting with the what is the objective, and how are we actually going to measure success? And I think that is actually a bigger problem, is actually what expectations. We're seeing a little bit of a resurgence of the boards back in the day saying we need an app. Now, they didn't know why they needed an app, but the board decided that we needed an app, and therefore people were asked to go and procure one. And I think we're seeing a lot of instances of organizations where they're saying, the board is putting pressure to say we need to have an AI strategy, we need to be using AI, and that's driving it. But I think also making sure that the outcomes being talked about internally are realistic. I think as suppliers, it's incumbent on us to sort of say either yes, no, or not yet. So I think the no, because actually fundamentally this is just ethically not the right thing to do. You shouldn't be using technology in this area right now, or no, not yet. And the no, not yet, I think is really, I mean, we can see some wonderful examples of that in the last months, where the vision, the graphical production models have just leapt in the last few months in terms of, this is not really reliable to, absolutely, you can use Gemini for that. That's a fantastic model that's doing some amazing things on image production, so that, I think the no, not yet is also relevant.
I want to come back to the ethical question you raised in a minute, but first of all, just on the measuring success, because that's a really important thing as well. And it comes back to this theme we've been talking around about making sure you're actually framing the problem and getting that right before you jump in. One of the big challenges is that people don't know how to go from doing a pilot to actually just scaling up this thing. So, we're talking about how do you get started. People can try some of these pilots. They can get someone in their team, or maybe they can get hands-on. They can create some of these agents or other workflows and use these tools. But how do you get from that to then actually scaling it across the business without having that sort of problem where you set it up really high expectations, the pilot doesn't deliver, and then everybody thinks it's not going to work, and then you lose all funding and all momentum?
Yeah, and I think that's something that we've been specifically looking at with our product is it's the difference between I can set up a knowledge bot with some sort of basic RAG techniques, and I can see I can prove the point that this is valuable, but that is fundamentally different to scaling something that's either going to deal with volumes of traffic, because that's one variable. Obviously, one of the other considerations is that, and this comes back to one of the things that really fundamentally drives me, is that as the context windows get bigger, meaning I can put more information in, that doesn't reward good behavior, doesn't reward being efficient in our usage of AI, because there's becoming less and less consequence of us actually jamming more and more into the context windows, which, and then obviously as the AI costs becoming reduced, that also doesn't reward good behavior as it relates to the sheer energy consumption that is being required to run these things. So I think there is a big difference between the sort of, and this is not an AI problem, this is an engineering problem, so when you're wanting to engineer large scale systems that are also secure with all of the kind of risks around security and sort of, jailbreaking or sort of poisoning of sort of agents there, it's really about the platforms that you build on. So I think as an organization, people can say, well, look, I'm not going to go through much of an extended procurement as it relates to choosing a platform to prove a point, to prove that this conceptually will work. But when it then comes to rolling out in production and scaling something, then there are different fundamental platform requirements, I would say, in terms of rolling out. So it's the difference between sort of proof of concept versus enterprise deployment. One of the other fundamental things, though, is the nature of testing. And if we talk about testing in the sort of traditional sense of testing around, I have inputs, I put inputs into my software, I get consistent outputs. These things are quite easy to test. They're quite easy to run through, robust sort of testing regimes in order to validate and be certain that we can put something into production. One of the things that we know with AI, because of sort of the probabilistic nature of things, is you actually need to use AI to test AI. So we, for example, when we look at document ingestion at scale, we will have so when we look at, for example, testing of sort of document ingestion at scale, we will sort of ingest documents, have some sample questions that should be answered from this knowledge that we've ingested. We will then have sort of templated human answers to the questions that we've asked. And then what we will then do is use another AI model to go through those sort of templated answers and the human answers and compare to the AI answers in order to sort of, in a fuzzy way, validate that these answers are being met, which is a very, very different thing to the traditional software testing. So there's all manner of considerations, and I think that just comes with experience.
Really. And from a skills perspective there as well. So we talked about the pilots, that they might be something that people could try having a go at themselves. Now we're talking about these more complex workflows where you want to set some targets, you need to think about the design, you need to run these tests you were just suggesting here as well. That sounds like it's going to be more technical and therefore require different, greater skills. What advice would you have for someone listening to this thinking, well, I could get my head around the pilot bit, but I'm a little bit concerned I'm not going to be able to do that sort of technical part?
Yeah, and I think this is just, this is the nature of sort of consultancies and consultancies like ours that are kind of bridging the gap, I think, between the sort of the AI model provision and the kind of the architecture around building substantial technology platforms, which is so I think there are a number of established, I think, technology businesses that sort of have the sort of I guess technical prowess to be able to deploy large scale systems, and this is technology like everything else. There are some fundamental differences in terms of ideas from the likes of sort of library science, understanding sort of ontologies and organizational knowledge, and that is a very different thing. That's not sort of, am I using .NET, am I using Java, am I using PHP? So there is a I think the sort of the business understanding and sort of translation from business understanding into tech is the key point. But yeah, it's really around referenceability. And I think at the moment what we know is that there are a number of lots of people doing pilots and lots of people doing POCs. What I would say as well is we're starting to see those sort of second time round projects, which is really interesting for me. And what I mean by that is where people have gone out to market. They've either had a consultancy build them an entirely custom solution, or they've selected some technology and they've proved the point and it's worked. But then they've hit a limit, and that limit might be either budgetary of it's really expensive building everything yourselves rather than a product, or they're then looking to upgrade. And I suppose the analogy would be also, for a membership association where they've outgrown their Excel spreadsheet, or they've outgrown their homegrown membership system, and they're looking to sort of go up markets a little bit. So that's starting to happen, which is a sort of a sign of things starting to mature, I guess, a little bit.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think that analogy with outgrowing the Excel spreadsheet, I mean, I think people can probably relate to that, right? I mean, there's a certain amount you can do yourself with your own Excel skills, but then once it gets to a certain level and you're trying to handle data, you realize you need to have more of a enterprise or a SaaS solution where you actually can outsource that problem to people who can help you take it to the next level. Last sort of topic I wanted to cover off was risks, and maybe this covers off some of the ethicality questions as well, but we often get asked questions about the risks, and I'm sure you do when you're talking to businesses who are coming on board, the associations. So what are some of the key risks that you're getting asked about, and some of the solutions that maybe you could help our audience understand?
Yeah, so I think obviously the risks take different forms, and there's typical kind of systems risks in terms of if you're creating some kind of front-facing AI agent. There are clearly risks associated with it parroting things that you don't want it to. We've seen some pretty public examples of AI agents expressing views that would perhaps not align with your organizations. Now, I think a lot of that can be mitigated with sort of good prompting, and you can still, of course, there's still risks associated with that. I mean, I think the sort of standard cyber risk is obviously it not specifically an AI problem. It is I'm building platforms that are the front-facing problem. I think data processing and really just not treating things as a black box, and knowing the flows of your systems and understanding what's being used where. We're seeing an increasing interest in people deploying open weights or open source models. Where people are saying, well, look, we're not prepared to take the risk that somebody might come along and enter in some personal data. So we're interested in what we can host ourselves, or what we can have hosted in a sort of a more controlled fashion. I think the biggest risk really for organizations is an AI giving somebody the wrong information. And what are the consequences of that, where somebody relies on that information? So clearly, in a healthcare setting, for example, giving a doctor some information and then some citation that says, this is what I believe the answer to be, and you should go and check it on page 6 of the kind of practice notes. And you're mitigating your risk through citation in terms of being able to say, this is the answer, but you should go check. I think where the AI is kind of giving its chain of thought, where it's actually saying, here is the answer, and this is what I understand from what you've told me of your question, that mitigates the risk, by actually saying where it's playing back what it has understood that has led it to give you the answer that it's given. Gives an opportunity for the questioner to actually say, well, no, actually that's not right. But I think the main thing is really treating AI like you would a regular colleague. So if you have a regular colleague that is operating on personal data and is making changes and things like that, you'd use auditing. You'd have audits that would allow you to actually go back and say, well, this thing made this decision, and this is the information that it was given, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of human parallels really in terms of, how do we keep an eye on our staff? How do we make sure our staff do good things? Least access, I think, as well, in terms of I can't remember the terminology, but when some of these kind of scandals happened in finance in the US, there was kind of Sarbanes-Oxley. There was various kind of standards that came out in terms of that sort of separation of concerns. Where you would actually sort of you wouldn't have one person that could set up an account for a new company and one person that could also raise the invoice. So applying similar kind of parallels of sort of separating agents out and having them check each other's work and those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you for sharing that insight there. There is a lot which is happening, and I think this is part of the excitement, but also the challenge. How fast the AI industry is moving is that there are so many areas where we are trying to sort of build the plane as it's sort of as it's kind of gliding along. But what you said there, I think around the risks, that's a really important point around the idea that companies, organizations that have sensitive data, it's now almost it's essential for them to build their own tech stacks which aren't public. They're internal. Just as we wrap things up, I wonder whether you could just give some advice on what that process looks like. If we're an organization and we're worried about not wanting to put all of our sensitive data out there on one of the big foundation models because we want to keep it secure, how do they go about thinking about that particular challenge?
Yeah, and there's a layering, right? So, for example, when you break the problem down, there are various different techniques. So you could take the view that when I have a question or when I have data, I'm going to use a local model, and my local model is going to look at the question, it's going to look at the data it's involved, and it is going to make a judgment. So a little bit like an orchestrator that says, okay, my job is not to understand the question in terms of being able to answer it, but to understand the question in terms of what this question is, what it relates to, does it contain any personal data? So you can orchestrate things such that you can understand the question and say, look, this is fine to go off and use an external model. This is fine to use Claude. It's fine to use, OpenAI. But there's also a tiering, which I think people don't understand, which is to say, well, okay, at one end of the scale, maybe there's xAI and there's Grok, or there's OpenAI, or there's, Anthropic. And maybe those are US hosted models, and there may be a kind of a data residency consideration rather than this is personal data. It's just, am I happy with my data going off to the US, right? Which is, for some organizations, is the thing. But then as you move through in terms of actually saying, well, I can actually run my own Azure tenant and I can actually have access to some of OpenAI's tech within that. Or in the case of Amazon, I can run Claude models within Amazon Bedrock and I can have them hosted in Frankfurt. So actually my EU data residency concern is less of a thing. So, there's many techniques that what I will say is that, it is perfectly possible now with these open weights models to run really capable models that can do amazing things on relative commodity hardware. So in our business, for example, we have customers that we're talking to that are perfectly happy using OpenAI. They're perfectly happy using Anthropic. It's entirely appropriate. And we have people that where we are hosting models for them on Amazon, with our business on our own GPU, on their GPUs, or people that want to actually rack their own hardware in their own own data centers. So that is, not to trivialize it, but that's just a networking problem. It's a networking security problem in terms of where is the brain that I'm talking to. I think the advice though is to kind of we were talking to a business the other day where they're saying, oh, we absolutely couldn't use this model, but we want to take these Otter transcripts and feed them in. It's like, well, you're using Otter, which is obviously, so sometimes it's a perception thing more than anything else in terms of it. When we dig into it, we find a lot of the time the concern is not really the AI providers, the concern is security. And the concern is understanding where my data is going and being able to at least make judgments rather than, concerns over particular providers.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating, isn't it, to think about actually going back to hardware on site, having the servers back in there. We kind of, some of us remember those server rooms with the flashy lights that every office used to have back in the day. And we seem to be almost going back to that mode. Just to wrap things up now, because we could go on talking about there's so many topics, and we'll come back and have you in other podcasts as well. But what is the sort of one thing that you're most excited about as you look at 2026 and think about what's coming either in your business or in the AI technology more broadly?
Yeah, so for me, it's chat is kind of the dominant modality for how we interact with AI at the moment for most people. We're going and asking bots, or we're using Claude on our desktops and asking questions. I think starting to move away from chat as being this sort of this active relationship where I go and ask a question and I get an answer. So we're seeing deploying more within workflow. So this is effectively saying, okay, I've set up this agent that I'm having operating on a schedule. It's reporting back. It's it's delivering me work product that I can then validate or approve. I've been sort of terming a phrase which I call lane assist, which is for me is that kind of that gap between which I don't think's there yet, which is I've got these agents where I've set my objectives and I'm just leaving it to it. I really don't think that's a good idea for most businesses in terms of, I might get a surprise in terms of how it's decided the most efficient way to deal with the bugs was to delete the entire code base, for example.
Efficient.
I mean, efficient, but suboptimal. Yeah. So I think, at one end of the scale, we've got this kind of outcome-based, leave it to its own devices kind of agent world. And at the other end, we've got a sort of, I ask it questions and it gives me answers. I think that sort of the middle ground for me is really exciting in terms of, it's a cognitive partner whereby it is surfacing things that I may, based on its sort of knowledge of my, it's almost like a semantic layer that can apply across my organization, where it knows me, it knows my processes, I've described my SOPs, and it is watching for things that I find interesting. It's surfacing knowledge to me in a proactive way rather than a reactive way. And it's kind of the lane assist analogy is kind of keeping my staff on track by giving me the right information at the right time. I think that for me is exciting. I think any kind of work amplifier, right, where it's able to kind of bring information front and center. I think even in kind of sort of higher risk settings where we have organizations that operate case management, where they deal with large numbers of cases. There's a huge amount of work to do. Having sort of call center workers where they're given the right information at the right time, perhaps with suggestions as to where to go next or what to do next and the reasoning as to why. And for me, I think it's the difference between kind of knowledge, wisdom, and judgment. And I think if we look at the AI element in terms of giving us knowledge, making it easier to access the knowledge, now moving up the chain in terms of how does the AI support us in our wisdom and the wisdom from the crowd. And then obviously, at some point the AI is going to be making judgments. But I think actually that those lower two pieces is actually the really valuable bit.
Yeah, no, I love that idea of creating wisdom there as well. But I think that's actually the valuable part of what we couldn't do as humans, because we couldn't process all of that information, all of that data to understand what's happening across an entire organization, because there's just too much. But actually, that's where machines can come in and help us to process all of that information, to have that sort of organization level wisdom. That's a great idea. Also love the phrase work amplifier. But I think that's actually, we've been struggling to try and kind of like talk around how it can augment humans, but actually what your phrase there of amplifying, that's exactly what it's doing. So last thing, how can we stay in touch and find out more about Pixelate?
Yeah, so we have a number of websites, clearly. So pixelate.com is our main.
The number 8.
PIXL number 8. Yes, if I was to have my time again, I'd probably spell it right. And our AI business, Ready Intelligence. So readyintelligence.com.
Amazing. Well, Alex, we're going to have to wrap it up there. We could talk for hours. We have, and we will do more sessions as well. But we've covered such a lot of ground there. I think the big takeaway for me is the importance of framing this as a business need. And the technical skills and the technical understanding is important. But if you get that business need right, then everything else will flow. And then out of that will come a plan. And you don't have to be a technologist to create a plan, but you have to be able to have those targets, set those targets, know how you're going to measure it, give yourself a timeline, and that will then allow you the framework to deliver the technology, and you can figure out what technologies you need. So that's been great. And also love that phrase, work amplifier. I think I'm going to have to use that maybe as a title for the episode. But Alex, it's been great to chat to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.